to get to be here with you guys because tonight we are shifting gears, and as we wind up our study on Russell's book, we have one more week, which is the conclusion, but tonight really is kind of the culmination of everything we've done up to this point. And so just what I want to do is lay out for us how we have gotten to where we are, because tonight the concept that we want to wrestle with is how we need to lose our stability. We need to come to grips with where we are as a church, as an evangelical church, and reminding us that what it means to be evangelical is to say that the good news of Jesus, the evangelion, is worth sharing with the world. And if we lose our stability and understand that we are in a fractured state, then revival is what we need. And so what I want to talk about tonight is what revival, first off, is not, and then to say what revival really is. And so before we get there, I want to I at the beginning of this said, we're not going to take questions so much the night of, but we will take questions via email or conversation afterwards. And last week, one of the things that I said was that Russell reminds us that in order to maintain our witness, we have to have moral integrity. We have to maintain the moral witness of the church and for you as an individual Christian. And part of that, in that lesson, one of the things that I said was that so many of us find ourselves using language of, well, I'm choosing between the lesser of two evils, right? When we cast a vote, whether it's for president, for mayor, for anything, I'm choosing between the lesser of two evils. And Hannah Arendt, who's a great philosopher, she famously said that when we use that framework, that those of us who claim the lesser evil quickly forget that they still choose evil. And I think that's really poignant and that's really powerful. And what made it even more so as we went throughout this week was that I don't know if you pay attention to the news, but the Pope came out talking about the American election and talking about our two representatives, Vice President Harris, former President Trump. And what did Pope Francis say? But he said, you are choosing between the lesser of two evils. And he has various reasons as to why he says that. And so a few different folks came to me and they said, well, Will, what do we do? Because what you are saying and what the Pope is saying is we're choosing between evil one way or the other, and those who choose evil quickly forget they do choose evil. And this to me is the most important piece, because it is possible when we hear rhetoric like that to become paralyzed, to say, then what are we supposed to do? And I want to remind you that at the core of our framework as evangelical Christians is this wonderful idea that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, right? All have sinned. And if that means Kamala Harris is, to use language that I think we ought to soften, evil, and if Donald Trump, using language that we ought to soften, is evil, then what we also have to remember is, so are you. So am I. And so when we go into this political cycle in this season and we make decisions about who we're going to vote for, the reason why this matters so much is because then we are able to say we recognize the brokenness of the person that we are choosing. And the problem that we talked about last week in the evangelical framework is how quickly we abandoned our moral framework in order to endorse someone that we felt like was achieving our objectives. And that's a problem. I'm not telling you who to vote for. But what I am telling you is, and the point of last week was to say, the moment we equivocate and we say that this person is good and this person is bad, we have lost the narrative plot line. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Whoever you vote for, and I'm not just talking about this election cycle, If you were alive in 1930 something and you voted for Franklin Delano Roosevelt, if you were alive in 1980 and you voted for Ronald Reagan or Jimmy Carter, the same rhetoric applies. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And as a church, when we try and justify one candidate over the other as the moral exemplar, we've lost the ability to have faithful witness to the world. Does that make sense? Again, I'm not telling you who you should or should not vote for. I think there are strengths that we ought to look at. I think there are platforms we ought to consider as followers of Jesus, but that's your call. I have friends who will vote for Kamala Harris, and I genuinely know they love Jesus. And I have friends who will vote for Donald Trump, and I genuinely know they love Jesus. And the minute any of us is willing to say that voting for either person disqualifies you from loving Jesus, you have forgotten that, y'all, that's not what this is about, okay? So that's the goal from last week. And that was an email exchange and a couple of conversations I had that I want to remind us of. And so what we've talked about throughout the whole of this study has been basically the evangelical framework is broken, right? We know something is wrong. We've lost our bearings. We have forgotten what it ultimately means to say that we believe the gospel is good news and that it is good news for all people. And if in fact we know that there is something amiss, that there's something wrong in the church, then what do we need? What do we need to have take place? And Russell lays out in this chapter that what ultimately we need is revival. And so that's what I want to talk about for the next little bit. A revival of anything often looks disturbingly different or doomed to irrelevance, but really it's a reconnection to roots so old that they seem new. I love that. And if you're reading the book, and I encourage you, even if you haven't read it right now, go back and read it. Because the kind of setup, the metaphor that Russell uses is he talks about country music. And he talks about how Willie Nelson, do we have any Willie Nelson fans? Yo, I grew up, my dad, his favorite, I say record, it was a tape back in the day, was The Redheaded Stranger. You guys remember that? I could sing to you that entire album on repeat. I actually own the DVD of the movie The Redheaded Stranger. Did y'all even know there was a movie called The Redheaded Stranger? Don't buy it. It's awful, but the record is really good. And so Russell talks about how Willie moves to Nashville from Austin, Texas, because he wants to make it in the country music industry. And what he discovers is in the time when Willie moves there, it's all rhinestones and sequins. It's all kind of hyper-produced country music, and it's all cheesy, and Willie is just not making it. And so finally he reaches a point when he gives up and he moves back to Austin. And when he moves back to Austin, what he discovers is an entire collective of artists who are doing country music in the way that he actually connected with, that resonated with his soul. And so Willie ends up becoming Willie Nelson, and Merle Haggard becomes Merle Haggard, and Waylon Jennings becomes Waylon Jennings, and it's this entirely new genre of country music, outlaw country, right? Which I love so much. And it was a drastic departure from what was the hyper-produced country music that everyone said, this is good, you don't need this because this will fail. But actually what is happening in that moment, Willie and Waylon and others are taking the best of the tradition of country music and going back deeper because country music had lost its soul. And he uses that metaphor to say maybe, just maybe, we find ourselves in that same sort of moment in the church. That in order to have a true revival, it might look different than anything that we could imagine in the current moment. But in fact, what it really is at the most deep level is a reconnection to the roots of something so old that it seems new. I think sometimes we have to remind ourselves that the Christian tradition didn't start in America, but the Christian tradition goes all the way back 2,000 years to a bunch of poor people and a bunch of rednecks and nobodies and nothings in Palestine, in Jerusalem, and in that area. So it might seem irrelevant, but true revival is going so much deeper than where we want to go. And so here's what I want to talk about. What isn't revival? Or maybe what revival is not. And Russell lays this out where he says, some people, when we use language of revival, right? We need revival in our land. Have you heard that before? Have you heard that rhetoric before? If you go to certain churches, y'all, certain Baptist churches, big Baptist churches, you'll go to a 4th of July service. And what you will find is an enormous American flag that drops back behind preachers. And you will hear anthems sung in the Church of Jesus Christ, where the key song for the day is not Nothing But the Blood. It's not How Great Thou Art. It's not Amazing Grace. But it's Make America Great Again. And that's not an exaggeration. It's a true example. And when we do things like that, and when we think that's what the gospel is, we need revival. What are we doing? We're actually saying revival means get back to normal. Get back to the way things were, except maybe with some more people. I cannot tell you how many times I have been in our church. Let's take it grassroots for a minute. And people will say to me, in the 1970s, in the 1980s, in the 1990s, can we just go back to where we were? But I want to remind you that for a whole lot of people who have a different color skin than me, for a whole lot of people that come from a different socioeconomic class than us, going back to normal in the definitions we use is nothing to aspire to. Because it wasn't that long ago when if a church like ours is willing to be honest, if a black brother or sister came to the door on Sunday morning, do you know what we would do? We'd turn them around and tell them to go somewhere else. If we think revival means go back to the way things were, then we are not thinking properly about what revival ultimately is. Revival means something so much more. When we think about what revival actually is and what we mean it to be, that you are not going to be able to read what I'm about to put on this screen, but it comes from page 250. Hold on, let me get this right. I actually didn't write it down. But in that chapter, I want to read this quote to you. You can't read, if you read it, good on you. You got better sight than me. But thinking about the concept of revival, here's what one famous person said. I believe the imperative need of the day is not simply revival, but a radical reformation that will go to the root of our moral and spiritual maladies and deal with causes rather than consequences, with the disease rather than the symptoms. It is my considered opinion that under present circumstances, we do not want revival at all, because a widespread revival of the kind of Christianity that we know today in America might prove to be a moral tragedy from which we would not recover in 100 years. I want to read that last sentence again. A widespread revival of the kind of Christianity we know today in America might prove to be a moral tragedy from which we would not recover in 100 years. Now, I could give you opportunity to guess who said that, but I'm going to bypass it. It was said by A.W. Tozer, one of the most famous devotional writers that millions of Christians, even to this day, pick up and read in the morning for their devotional time. Do you know when he wrote it? 1957. 1957. When we are on the cusp of Billy Graham filling Yankee Stadium with 80,000 people, when we are on the cusp of revivals happening across the country. And what he says is, if we think revival is going back to the way things are, it will be a detrimental setback to the church that we will not recover for 100 years. That if we genuinely want renewal, or maybe the real definition of revival, it is something way deeper, way more meaningful, and way more substantive. And for me, you guys, that is really, really important. Going back is not the way forward. Going back is not the way forward. If you read the book, the Religion and Public Policy Initiative did a poll not that long ago, and they asked a variety of people from different Christian traditions, were things better in 1950 than they are today? Were things in Christian life better in 1950 than they were today? 71% of white evangelicals said that life was better in the 1950s. Less than half of black Protestants said life was better in the 1950s. Less than 37% of people unaffiliated with church. And so as we talk about revival, as we talk about what we think, what we hope and dream God will do in our land, we have to be incredibly clear that definitionally, substantively, that does not mean let's go back to the way things were. Because that isn't what God dreams of for the church in the future. We have to be clear about that. And one more thing we have to hit on before, let me see what this slide is. Okay, so one more thing we have to hit on. That another definition of revival right now that is really prominent and starting to pop up across evangelical culture. Do you guys remember Promise Keepers? Anybody remember Promise Keepers? Okay, so you guys know I didn't grow up a Christian, didn't grow up in the church, but when I was in middle school, 7th, 8th grade, I went to the Riverbend Baptist Church, which was a country church in Gainesville, and there was a group of guys that were deeply committed to this new movement known as the Promise Keepers. And I will never forget it. It was a powerful thing as a kid who wasn't a Christian, growing up in the country, not going to school with anybody of a different color skin than me until I went to college. That in this small country church, Riverbend Baptist, the Promise Keepers made a really big deal out of saying the faith we have in Jesus Christ is bigger than the colors of our skin. It's bigger than the ethnic boundaries that we have. And so the Promise Keepers back in the 1990s held a rally in Washington, D.C., where 1 million men showed up and they prayed for each other and they loved each other. And they talked about biblically, what does it mean to be a man who is faithful to Jesus and his family? And you might not agree with all the specifics of what it was, but at the end of the day, it was an honest to God movement that was trying to reclaim something beautiful. Now, flash forward to 2024. And just a few months ago, guess what? After it had fallen away from the public eye, guess what pops back up on the scene? Promise Keepers, run by an entirely different group of guys. And they're going to hold a rally in Washington, D.C. But instead of 1 million men who are talking about what it means to follow Jesus well and to love their wives and their family and to love other human beings regardless of the color of their skin and their ethnic background, this time in 2024, the Promise Keepers meet in Washington, D.C. And do you know what they talk about? Reclaiming our country for a candidate who is our guy. Y'all, again, let me be clear to you. I'm not telling you who to vote for or who not to vote for. But the minute a religious movement that is supposed to be centered on the gospel of Jesus Christ says that our primary objective is to align with one candidate over another, it's wrong. It's wrong. And we need to be clear what revival is not, because the language that Promise Keepers is using then and now is language of revival. And so the question we have to ask ourselves is, what are we seeking to actually revive? What is it that we are seeking to revive? And the goal is not to get back to something, to a time that we all dream of as nostalgic, but let me remind you, it wasn't all that great for a lot of people who lived in that time, right? We all have illusions of grandeur, of eras gone by. And the goal is not to get back to something, but the goal is to seek renewal for the future. A renewal that will have continuity with the past, but it will often look strikingly different than anything that we might imagine. There's another great quote in the chapter where it says, revivals are paradoxically disruptive of the present while in deep continuity with the past. And so you guys, I want to remind us of a couple of things. That the goal is not to get back, but it's to move forward into the future. And so, I did it again. At least I didn't drop my remote this time, right? So if things are broken, and if the goal is not to go back, but the goal is to move forward, we need to ask ourselves, why do we want this to happen before we ask the question, what's next? And what Russell lays out in the chapter is maybe, just maybe, what we are experiencing in the evangelical world right now. And y'all, again, I want to be clear. I claim an identity as an evangelical. I claim an identity as someone who believes the good news. I hold the authority of Scripture. I hold fast that Jesus died for my sins and that he was resurrected on the third day. I hold the centrality of all the Orthodox Christian doctrine that is central to who we are. And yet we have to be honest with ourselves. Y'all, the thing is broken. And the rush of American Christianity, according to Russell, is to say, it's broken, how do we fix it? It's broken, what do we do to get it back on track? And Russell says maybe before we ask what's next, we ought to ask why. And he uses an example in his book that I think is really beautiful, where he says, remember the Tower of Babel? Remember the Tower of Babel? Where they tried to build a ladder up to heaven, and they tried to show how great they were and how powerful they were. And God is ultimately the Tower of Babel didn't fall because of anyone who was at Babel. The Tower of Babel fell because God made it fall. Because God was humbling the people in that moment. And guess what comes immediately after Babel? Abraham. Immediately after, there's a group of people who say, we want to be so strong and powerful, we're going to build a ladder to heaven. Just a couple chapters later in the book of Genesis, God calls Abraham. And in Genesis 15, he says, Abraham, look up at the stars of the sky. Do you see how numerous they are? I'm going to make your people as numerous as the stars in the sky. And through you and your people, the world will be blessed. And so God tears down this one thing so that something genuine and beautiful and good can be birthed into the world, right? The Tower of Babel was about proving our power and our strength and our goodness. And God's call to Abraham was about sharing his goodness with the world. So before we ask what's next, maybe we ought to ask, why is this happening? Maybe we find ourselves in this moment culturally because God's doing something. God's humbling us in the present moment and saying, maybe you have lost the narrative. Maybe that's it. So what do we do? What do we do? And this is where I want to spend a pretty good bit of time this evening. Because the first thing Russell says, this has been really present and powerful in my own life recently, is he says, as we seek genuine revival, one of the first and most important things we can do is to embrace new communities and new friendships. There's a great story he tells in the book about how there's a lady named Beth Moore. You guys are familiar with Beth Moore? And there was a writer in 2007 who was asked a question about Beth Moore. And Beth Moore, if you don't know anything about Beth, Beth is one of the foremost women's Bible teachers in not only America, but probably the world. And it doesn't do us quite as much now, but still really significant. And, in Baptist life, in our strain, Southern Baptist life, women are not supposed to teach who? Men. Okay, it's a thing. It's a thing for us. And so in 2007, there was a man who was asked, what do you think about Beth Moore? And this gentleman says, Beth Moore is a slippery slope. If you listen to Beth Moore and you fall under her teaching, it's a slippery slope before you start allowing women to preach in front of men. And do you know who wrote that in 2007? Russell Moore. And y'all, when Russell Moore is going through the meat grinder of the Southern Baptist Convention, when he is being forsaken by his friends of decades, while he is being a faithful witness to Jesus and being kicked out of the convention that he spent his life defending, do you know who loved on him and reached out to him? Beth Moore. And in this beautiful section, y'all, and this is really important, Russell talks about how on the edge of every argument, there's a slippery slope on both sides. And if you flank yourself too far on one side or the other, do you know where you are? On a slippery slope. Russell, and I believe this is absolutely true, is going to say that one of the best things we can do as we seek revival in the church, genuine revival, is to embrace new communities and friendships that stretch us, that remind us of the bigness and the goodness of God. That Russell spending time with Beth Moore reminded him that maybe she's not a heretic, that maybe she actually loves Jesus. Y'all, can I tell you something? I'm a denominational misfit. I didn't grow up in the church. The first church I ever worked in was a non-denominational megachurch. Then I became a United Methodist pastor for a while. And then I pastored in a cooperative Baptist church. And now I'm the pastor of the founding of the birthplace of the Southern Baptist Convention. I don't really fit anywhere, do I? But I had this sneaking suspicion y'all don't either. And that's a good thing. Because what I have discovered over the course of me working in church and holding the positions I believe is that I can meet someone of goodwill, someone who genuinely loves Jesus and with conviction will say to me, as I read the scripture, I can't get to the place where I affirm that women can serve as pastors. And in the same breath, I can be deeply committed and friends with someone who believes like me that God says women can serve in any position up to and including senior pastor, because that's how I interpret the scriptures of what Paul says in Romans 16, what Jesus has an experience of Mary Magdalene. We don't need to prove all that right now. But the point being, when we open ourselves up to conversations beyond our tribes, what we will discover is that even if we disagree with people, we find that they can still be our friends. And what we will find is that actually some of the people we've been told are heretics and bad maybe love Jesus just as much or even more than we do. On Monday, I got a call from one of my dear friends in town, and he says to me, it's Mark Mond. Any of y'all know Mark? Mark is a financial guy, but his real passion, he's the pastor of a church called Riverview Church out in Evans. It was United Methodist Church, but that long before all the chaos, they left. And Mark calls me and he goes, Will, we got to have lunch. And I said, okay, who are we having lunch with? And he said, it's me, you, Cliff is the founder of 147 Ministries, which is a ministry for folks that are in recovery And Cliff was a former drug dealer. And I show up wearing pastor clothes, and Cliff shows up wearing sweatpants and a hoodie and a Atlanta Falcons hat. And a guy who works at First Presbyterian Church down in downtown Augusta, which is a PCA church, which means, y'all, they're real conservative. Like, they would say this, they'd admit it. They're real conservative theologically. And I'm sitting at the table with my friends, and you know what my first thought is? Man, I don't know what I'm doing here right now, you guys. And you know what I found over the course of my lunch together with these friends? Is that actually we all believe that Jesus is at the center of what we're trying to do. And we believe that the fabric of our church and our culture is being torn apart because of the division that is taking place politically and in the church. And y'all, there was this beautiful moment where I find myself thinking like, my guys, this is so beautiful. And then Cliff goes, hey man, I'm just curious, have y'all been getting a lot of political junk lately at your churches? And Mark goes, oh man, I got a couple of books people gave me recently that are just crazy. And the guy at First Pres goes, yeah, it's pretty intense at our church. And I said, I'm teaching a class on politics right now. It's really cool. But I actually said, yeah, you know what? Same thing here. And it's a group of guys that 20 years ago would have never been in the same room together. But what we find in the true revival of God is that the definition, maybe it's next. I can't remember if I wrote it. Oh, I didn't write it in there. But hopefully I wrote it on my notes. Revival in Scripture from Pentecost on always upends the definitions of the pronouns we and us. The true revival of God from Pentecost, right? Because prior to Pentecost, every follower of Jesus would have been Jewish. But after Pentecost, the doors are blown off the thing, right? Every true revival from Pentecost on upends the definitions of the pronouns we and us. That the kingdom is more expansive than we imagine. And part of what Russell is saying is maybe if we embrace new communities and friendships, what we will find is we're struggling with some of the same things. We're wrestling with some of the same things. And we all, most importantly, agree on the centrality of Jesus as the one who can get us past all of this. Yeah, you guys, that to me has been a beautiful thing. I got a text message today from Bobby Smith. Bobby's the pastor of Journey Church in Evans, which is a Pentecostal church. And Bobby texted me at 7:30 in the morning. He goes, Will, I woke up praying for you this morning. And I just want you to know what an honor it is to do ministry with you in this city. Y'all, stuff like that wouldn't have happened long ago. And yet, when you embrace new friendships and new communities, what you find is maybe the boundaries of our faith is bigger than what we imagine. And the final thing that Russell says is in order to seek genuine revival, what we need to do is pray. And not the sort of prayer that says, hey, Carol, I'll pray for you. Yep, I heard you, I'll pray for you, okay? Which really means I'm thinking about you. But genuine prayer, which means I'm going to go before the Father and I'm going to spend, depending on what your bandwidth is, and I don't mean that judgmentally, maybe it's 2 minutes, maybe it's 2 hours, genuinely seeking to bring our concerns before the Father who loves us and is there for us. But revival, you guys, revival in our land is not going back to where we were, but it's moving forward into something that is bigger and more beautiful. The other thing, last thing, and this is out of pocket in terms of the framework of the chapter, but it was a profound reminder for me that when Russell says true revival always upends the definitions of the pronouns we and us, is he goes, sometimes it's nice to remember that the next Billy Graham, he isn't sitting in a Southern Baptist church in Alabama or Georgia or Tennessee. But the next Billy Graham is probably somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa right now. Because the global center of evangelical Christianity, it is no longer in America. It is no longer in Western Europe, but it's in Africa and China, in South America, in the places where God is moving in ways that we can't even imagine. So it's a reminder that our friendships need to be bigger than the ways we limit. I love this chapter because so much of what I've had to do is be like, how am I going to say this without offending certain people? But tonight wasn't about offending. It's about saying, we know the thing's broken. What does it mean to make it better? And I love that. So 6:45, let's pause. What questions do you have this evening? Anybody? We got time. We figured it all out, right? Anybody? Yes, yeah. I'll translate in a minute, you guys. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. Yep. Sure. Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because now what has happened, so part of what we're talking about was Christianity represents the cross, government represents the sword, and part of our role as Christians is to pray for our government. And we reference Christianity in Stalinist Russia. And how one of the first things that happens in Stalinist Russia is the elimination of Christianity. Now, let's talk about today. Let's talk about what's happening in Russia today. Is that the Russian Orthodox Church and the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church has become a puppet of Vladimir Putin and has blessed the killing of Ukrainians in the name of God. And so what Russell is saying is, yes, absolutely, the church represents the cross and the state represents the sword. But what happens when the church gets too closely aligned and vouches for a government that does not speak the name of Jesus? And now the Russian church, God, bring a movement because they've forsaken the cross for the sake of the sword, right? So I totally get what you're saying, but the danger becomes when we so say these people are bad, so let's line up with this. It's not an easy. I think the temptation is to say this or that, but it really is, I think, a bigger question of how do we maintain fidelity to Jesus and Jesus alone? Because I'm serious. Now the Russian church has forsaken the gospel. The Russian Orthodox Church is no longer witnessing to the goodness of Jesus Christ because of what they've chosen to do. It's terrible. It's just as terrible as what happened in Stalinist Russia in the 1950s. It is. It sucks. Forgive me. It's terrible. Yes, the technical term. Oh, you guys, delete that from the live feed. Oh, yeah. What else? Oh, that's a great question, though. It really is. Christopher. Mm-hmm.
And Peter, trying to protect Jesus, trying to use the sword to do it, rather than leaning on Christ.
Yes.
elements of the sword to do it. And I think we have that same tendency. The intention is good to try to protect the church and
Yeah.
faith and such, but often we're building the wrong.
Yeah, well, that's a fantastic analogy where Christopher talks about when they're in the Garden of Gethsemane and Peter sees the Roman soldiers coming, and his initial reaction is to pull out his sword, and he slices off the ear of one of the centurions. And Jesus very quickly says, put up your sword, because those who live by that sword will die by that sword. And the temptation is there for all of us to say, we have to defend. We have to defend what's ours, what's there. But maybe there's a better way. Yeah, thank you. That's good. All right, hold on. Charles, in 1 second. Shirley. Ooh, yes. That was a great, so there's a line in the book where Russell says, what isn't repaired is repeated. What isn't repaired is repeated. And that goes back to, before we ask the question, what's next? Maybe we ought to think more deeply about why have we gotten into this place where we are. Yeah, what isn't repaired is repeated. Yeah, that was a good one. That was really good. Charles. Yeah. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. Yes. Okay. So let me thank you. That's a great question, or great comment, really, because I need to be careful in the verbiage. Where Russell is not saying revival is bad. What Russell is saying is, let's be careful how we define what revival is. And for so many people, revival has become go back to a bygone era. But what true revival is, as Russell says, revival is rooted in resurrection. And in order for us to have true revival, there are some things that have to die in order for something beautiful to be given to birth. But he says, thank you, because I didn't really stress that enough, where he really says, don't give up on revival, but let's be clear on what genuine revival really is. Does that help tease it out? And thank you for pressing me on saying the Russian Orthodox Church is bad. The patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church is bad. Thank you. Yeah, that's important. Yeah, very much so. What else? In bad, what did I say earlier? All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So as I sit here and call somebody bad, maybe I ought to look inside my own heart a little bit too. So I don't know. What else? All right, crickets are chirping. So 6:52. Email next week. Here's what's going to happen. Nothing is happening in this room. I am not here. I'm out of town. And so we'll take a week off. Then we'll come back together for our conclusion the following Wednesday night.